No one.
Absolutely believe that U.S. corporations can have a social conscience. The application of that social benefit, though, might not be in the U.S. And too often, U.S. corporations think that they need benefit the U.S. when that same amount of money and attention outside the U.S. could yield much greater benefits.
I have a question, two questions actually, I'd like us all to be thinking about while we're having this discussion. By the way, the reading was great fun. My first question uh, is it possible to train wolves not to savage sheep? And if so, once you've accomplished that, are they still wolves? In other words, is a capitalist with a social conscience still a wolf or something else?
Well, underneath that is your idea of what defines capitalism. I
Right.
mean,
And
that's
that's
the
done.
prior question.
It's the question is based on the reading, especially of Mr. Hanauer and Mr. Bolding, who both have a rather bizarre, I think, view of what capitalism is. And so hence my question.
And I've looked at most of these videos, but that was a while ago. So would you sum up what you take it to be their idea of capitalism that you think is unusual?
Ah, neither of what I consider to be the most insightful people who discussed this issue seem to recognize the historical fact that capitalism, especially neoliberal capitalism, is the oldest socio-political economic system in the world. And it boils down to there's a few rich people, a lot of poor people, and a few middle class tradespeople and craftsmen in between. That's always been the system back way before Hammurabi, certainly in Rome and pre-industrial uh, Europe. It's just feudalism was just neoliberal capitalism with a different name. So when you start talking about adding social conscience to a system that's 8,000 years old, it gets a little dicey. And then you get people like Hanauer who have converted, seen their on their road to Damascus. I note that he didn't give up his money, but anyway, so he has his moment, and then he gets it all wrong again. He says, for example, that cooperation is what makes everything work. Well, that's not so. You need two things. You need cooperation and you need good leadership. That's what capitalism is all about, in theory, is that the rich people are supposed to be the smart people who are supposed to then direct development so everybody benefits. But as we all know, that isn't what happens. So it gets a little confusing to me.
So I had a kind of a pre-question on all of this, and that is, and that was the degree we can think about economics as rational. And I'm not an economist by any stretch of the manner, but I've heard that conversation that economists talk about, is economics rational or is it not rational? I guess there's some that are really in the rational school and others that are not. They're more like behavioral, or maybe that's not the right term, but I think the interesting question is, is the invisible hand, so-called, from Adam Smith, to what degree is it rational? And I think that there's certainly some degree that it's not, in the sense that, for instance, we see from today from the MAGA conservatives sort of the burn it down philosophy. In other words, if rather than to succumb to progressive ideology, it's kind of like, well, let's just go in and smash everything up. Well, that's obviously not rational, but it's certainly operating on sort of emotion or human sort of power, differential. So to me, and even on the individual level, the simplest way to think of these power differentials is a zero-sum game. And that's kind of what throws me over to what I think James is trying to say, in the sense that, when that's the way you think of things, is that, look, if I win, if I win, the other guy's got to lose. And if I lose, the other guy's going to win. And therefore I'm going to, do everything I can to make sure I win and the other person loses. That's a simple way to think. Whereas when to think about synergies, the fact that maybe I could win and the other person could win at the same time, I think that's a little bit more difficult to get your mind around. And that's why I think, from the perspective of power, it's just easier to think about winners and losers. And that's where I think it sort of gravitates away from, even if what Hannah is saying is rational, I think that's what sort of gravitates away from that, because people just sort of tend to think in these, me versus them, zero-sum game, winner loser, and that kind of, I think, defeats the concept of conscious capitalism. I'd like to think conscious capitalism can work, but I have my doubts.
But see, there's a concept of sum zero, where if one person wins, the other person must lose. And we know that that is not the case, or should not be the case.
I think you're absolutely right, Norman. I think it is not the case, and I think it should not be the case. But I think in the minds of many, or maybe not so much even the minds of many, but sort of just in the gut of many people, they still operate on that basis, even though by operating on that basis, they can sometimes bring harm to themselves. I think one of the best people that articulates this is a person like Warren Buffett. I mean, I've seen him make statements, I need to be taxed more. And he's not making that statement based on being, altruistic, but he's saying, hey, listen, if my stock value is going to go up, I've got to have other people that can buy stock. And in order for them to buy stock, they've got to have some degree of prosperity. But I think that kind of thinking is largely, absent in the world of business.
Yeah, but Henry Ford had the concept that paying the automobile employees a fair wage would allow them to buy product.
Yeah, I think there are many examples of what you're talking about. I think it's somewhat of a tug of war between these two schools of thought, and I guess the question then comes down to is, where do most people default to? And just my gut tells me that a lot of people just default to, kind of, what was that movie, The Lion of Wall Street, or The Wolf of Wall Street? I think a lot of people just say, hey, that's the way it is, and that's the way it works for me.
So
Even
are you
despite
saying,
the fact that there are some-
Mike, that the default is basically greed is good?
I think a lot of it is. I think unfortunately, a lot of it gravitates in that direction. I wish it wasn't so. And I think, as Norman says, I think there are some good examples of where it's not so, but I think those are mainly voices crying in the wind.
Okay, I think
Well,
that I somewhat agree with you and so disagree, Mike. I think that probably most people, at least in my life and my experience, can easily understand that if I win and you win, we're all better off. It's a game theory. The problem, I mean, we can clearly see this in politics, is that there are, I think, a small group, a minority of people who are extremely, bully or greedy, and they become leaders, and then other people follow them, because most people, I think, are followers. So I think probably your average person could easily understand that we would all do better if we win, but we end up having these outliers who, take all the noise and lead everyone.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, Joyce, and maybe that's right. I guess I see maybe more of them being outliers. I see them more mainstream, but who can know for sure? That's just sort of my perception of how it works.
I throw a little history in here, which is that before there was big ag, before there was domesticated animals, we had tribes that were hunters and gatherers, and they were forced to cooperate each and every day, because otherwise, if they didn't hunt and they didn't gather together, they would all starve. Then we got a domestication of plants and animals, and that led to storehouses and warehouses and surpluses. And that had to be, you had to build the storehouses and warehouses and the corrals, and you had to guard the surplus. You had to guard the cattle. That means you had to have soldiers, you had to have builders, and you had to have a strong leader to coordinate all this. So we went from tribes, which didn't get along with other tribes, but they had to, each tribe had to cooperate within itself. We went from that to big cities where there weren't tribes and there wasn't an everyday need because there was a surplus, but there was a ruler who decided what you were going to do and not do every single day. And with that, the whole idea of cooperation kind of atrophied. And we're just picking up on it again now, I think, realizing what we've lost.
I think you're making a good point. I think that we're witnessing the outcome of the late 20th century confluence of Martin Freeman in economics, Kohlberg in ethics, Dawkins in biology, all of whom presumed that the unit of action was the individual, not the community, and that the greed is good, the selfish gene, and the fact that morality was generated by each individual through stages all undermine the idea of cooperation and community. And that now we're seeing the results of that. And I worry that humanists participate in this with their emphasis on empathy as the leading moral value to the, and community as only second, perhaps. But I'm not as sure about that as I am about the other three.
It's good to feel that and know that I'm not alone. Thank you. The example of what you're talking about, I think, is Japan. I think Japan will help us all grasp this. I know it helps me. You look at Japanese capitalism, and there's all kinds of cooperation between the partnership group companies. But outside those companies,
Correct.
it's just like every other kind of cutthroat warfare. And so your point that it's not just individuals that are important, that's very true. But it's also who is cooperating with who and why. I think those are the questions that really help me focus on this reading is what kind of cooperation are we looking at? Who's in charge and what's the goal? Say, if the goal is to one guy accumulates all the marbles, that's different from everybody's goal is to make everybody a living wage. And how do we get from one to the other and stay in the right place is my question.
One of the things that makes me a little bit less optimistic is I did have a period in my life, about 3 years, when I did work for a Fortune 500 company. I don't think they're in business anymore. They were then called Letterly Labs. I think they may have been bought out by Park Davis, but it was a standard big pharma type of company. And one of the things that I really, in fact, kind of one of the reasons I left for is we had products that were really, they were in some cases 10 times more expensive than, what you call generic, standard tetracycline, for example. And, and the product that we had some modest clinical benefits. If somebody had, for instance, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, the product that we had might be a little bit better because it might give them a little insurance to keep them out of the hospital. But for your average person, it had really no clinical benefits over tetracycline. But the mantra was you had to push it for everything. And the idea of marketing to its appropriate niche was just, that was just like, no, we're not doing that. We're going to market it for everything. And that was not just that product, but every product we had was good for everybody and everything. And, that kind of thinking eventually was, I just couldn't deal with it anymore. And I left the company, but I think that's, maybe not so much in the corporate, advertising, or you can see something like that, but back in the sales room, by golly, you're going to see that, because your numbers the next month, one time my boss said, hey, listen, I need you to sell this for me. And, it was a big ask, and I went out and I did it, and I called him that night. I said, his name is Bruce, great guy, really great guy. And I said, well, Bruce, I got this done. He says, great. And he was congratulating me. And I said, well, half kiddingly, I said, well, what are you going to do for me now, Bruce? And he said, you get to keep your job. So that's kind of the mentality that I experienced. And that's one of the reasons I'm perhaps a little bit more pessimistic than maybe I should be.
Congratulations on quitting. The corporation didn't go bankrupt. Somebody else took your place, but you weren't doing it. Very good.
There's a classic play and movie, Glenn something.
Glenn Carey Ross.
The movie starred Jack Lemmon, but it was the cutthroat in a real estate office. And you're only as good as what you can sell, and you're cutting other people out, and you don't get the leads.
Glengarry Ross or something like that, Bob?
Yeah, something like that. It's kind of typical of what you're describing. Someone kind of check my memory, but somewhere in the back of my mind, I've got a Japanese model of the 70s of management and labor called the Z theory of management. Anyone remember that at all?
Talking about the X and Y
X
theory,
and Y, yeah.
X and Y?
the X and Y theory of management. I think might be what you're.
That had cooperation between the administrators and CEOs and the workforce.
Yeah, that was the
Decision
one.
making. Huh?
I'm not sure if I remember it exactly. I just remember it.
Yeah.
Okay, the key to all of these Far Eastern systems for social or commercial interaction is you have to have a concept of shame. They all require a healthy dose of what they call shame, what we in the West would call being embarrassable. If you can't be embarrassed, you can't run a Japanese company. And one of the things Americans are difficult to do is they tend not to feel shame. So that is one of the reasons Japanese systems don't work so well in the West.
So are the robber barons and the Gilded Age folks that are reappearing now, are they basically a cultural effect of the Western style, or is it universal?
Yeah, one of the big drawbacks of English becoming the universal language is that English provides a linguistic framework for all kinds of nasty Western concepts. You can't even express a lot of Western thinking in an Asian language. They simply don't have the words, and they don't have. It's gibberish to them until it gets translated laboriously. The English gets translated laboriously into their language. Then they begin to understand the concepts. But the more people who learn English, the less agreeable the world's going to become.
I read an article I thought was interesting on historical antecedents. It was kind of comparing the experience in Britain versus the experience in the United States with the Industrial Revolution. And, one of the things that, Britain obviously has had more robust social safety net systems than we have, although they're obviously under stress now, and there's a lot of conversation out in Britain. But one of the reasons, apparently, according to this article I read, that they had that is sort of their industrial revolution process did not have, as we had in the United States, this vast territory that people could, move to, sort of the go west young man kind of mantra. And so there was, we had similar types of things, all the mills in Massachusetts, et cetera. But, as my understanding, according to this article, we didn't have sort of what were the Hogarth, Gin Lane kinds of, paintings or, drawings, because of the industrialization had sort of this relief valve in the West that they didn't have. And as a response to that, and, the Fabian Society or whatever you want to call it, they sort of developed more of that sense of a communal experience. They also talked about World War I and World War II and the proximity to the war and the war effort versus obviously the United States being more distant. And so the point the article was kind of making is that they had some historical antecedents that sort of gave them a greater sense of social responsibility, whereas, in the United States, it's always been sort of, the great individual, and the, breaking the West and blah, 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 and all that kind of stuff. And that may account for some of the differences that we have versus maybe a more European way of thinking. I don't know, but that's just what this particular article was kind of trying to put forth.
But during the Eisenhower administration, I think that the maximum income tax rate went up to 93%. And that is not inappropriate to have a progressive income tax to support social justice administered by the federal government.
Agree with that 100%, Norman. I think Reagan was the one who actually kind of broke that system. If I remember correctly, Reagan saw, of course, Reagan grew up under very humble circumstances, but, when he finally made it big and acting and saw what his taxes were, I guess that's sort of what blew him through the roof and kind of, at one point he was kind of a liberal Democrat and, converted through, I guess, Nancy partly into more of a conservative Republican, but that was the dynamic that he said, hey, I don't like paying all these taxes, now that I'm wealthy. But as you say, it's because those taxes were pretty high in those areas. And we saw a lot of good come from that. The parks and the educational system and go to University of California for, next to nothing compared to today. It produced a lot of good things.
Mm-hmm.
I think what you just pointed out, Mike, is one of the biggest problems we face is that philosopher kings never get into office. People who can think along the lines we're talking about do not become politicians. So there it is then, discussing high-minded philosophical concepts is great, but inevitably we're brought back to the fact that even if we threw all the bums out like they did in the French Revolution, there's a whole gang of more bums ready to come in and take their place. So the issue is not how do we get, perhaps the issue is not how do we get people to cooperate, but how do we get the asshole top 1% to leave and not come back? That's the issue, I think.
But it's the top 1% that have caused the Code of Federal Regulations to be miles long with the tax concessions that legislators, one of the few things that they can do is benefit the wealthy.
Well, at least they have a purpose.
Yeah, we're back to the greed is good argument.
I think when it comes to politicians, as you were saying, James, I worked in local government my whole career, and I found that, there are some people who had ideals similar to me and some people who didn't, but what cut across the grain with politicians is they all generally thought and communicated at a fairly low education level, because that's how they got elected, because people responded to them. And I think that you're right about people who think things through. Now, what you would be hoping is that maybe the politician would have a friend who's a good philosopher who can think things through and explain it to his friend. But in general, I think that the type of person who's elected to office is not a thinker.
As a good
No,
example of this, probably the greatest.
Con men are the epitome of what politicians are.
But it goes beyond that, Norman. The greatest philosopher king of all time, and one of my favorite authors, Marcus Aurelius, epitomized the perfect philosopher king. And yet, while he was king, just as many people were killed on the frontiers as under any other emperor. So, you know, it gets very confusing. The very people who want to become leaders, you don't want to let them anywhere near leadership. But if you don't do that, who the hell's going to run the show?
I've said the same thing, James. The perfect person to get to be a police officer is someone who doesn't want to be a police officer.
Exactly.
Right, because anybody that wants to be a police officer wants to be authoritarian and dominate people, control them. Yeah. The very person that one would not wish to be a police
And
officer.
we're all now looking at the person least likely to ever be a policeman. Norman Woods, born and bred libertarian. We're safe. If he were somehow anointed dictator of the world, everything would go along just smoothly.
But the electability, there's the gap.
No, there's a problem.
So how effective are the current corporations with their compassionate conscience, so to speak, with the compassionate capitalism?
I think we could agree they're mostly about a zero. I think the problem is that the capitalism, at least as shown in the United States, is so focused on the short term, the next month, the next quarter, that there's no room for anything that could even look like, compassionate, even if it wasn't compassionate. There's no room for any sort of long-term thing that's better for society as a whole, because you want your profits to be as high as possible in your next reportable statement. And I think that's a serious problem with what's going on in the US, at least.
No, this quarterly earnings reporting is horrible, absolutely horrible.
Bill, you had a comment?
Well, I'll follow up on what Joyce just said. I think she's right. And I think if you look at the basic question of capitalism, it's always going to be in the interest of its investors. There are certain examples we have of enlightened capitalists who have, done well for their workers, and we see this ongoing. But they're the exception rather than the rule. And I think that the problem is that you need a counterweight to capitalism, which is probably government, which you had a strong leader like FDR that was able to go in there and just kind of be like Trump, do whatever he had to do to change the system. But usually, as you've been pointing out, the people that run government are beholden to the capitalists, and therefore it's hard to get that counterweight to work. But just on the simple question, can capitalism ever be fair, or what was the word you use?
Have a social conscience.
Have a social conscience. I think individually, some capitalists do try to do that, but by and large, I think it's the whole concept of capitalism is not going to work with a social conscience. So you need to have a counterweight, which I think is probably government, but as we see, that doesn't always work very well. But I think what it came out of what Joyce said is that people are, particularly in the US, the capitalists are working on short-term profits and, so, and it's difficult to just say, oh, well, you should do what's good for society, but not what's good for your shareholders. And then we go through these periods of great inequality, like the guild, what's her name? Richardson, what's her name anyway? She's
Heather Cox?
Yeah, Heather has talked about those cycles. And economists have verified that. I mean, we've seen that. So I don't know the answer, but I think the answer is I don't think we should look to capitalism to be compassionate in the long run.
One of the one of the definitions of capitalism that I came across while I was pondering this was by, I think his name was Polanyi in 1944, when he said it was the commodification of land, labor, and finance that actually brought about capitalism. And by that he meant that was stripping those three things of any moral or social element. You know, it's focusing only on their transactional value. And he called them false commodities because they were already in existence. They weren't produced by the system. They were already there, and they were stripped of all their other values. And I think that goes along with Friedman's whole thing about stockholder value being the only legitimate pursuit of corporations.
That's absolutely right. And that takes us back to the tribal thing. When you're a member of a tribe, you work every day for everybody's benefit because that's the way the system works. Under capitalism, you work every day to make you yourself better off, and that's the way that system works. So maybe tribalism has a bad name, is all I'm saying.
But European capitalism now involves not just the investors, but other stakeholders like their employees in the
Absolutely.
administration of the capitalistic goals.
And that's worked beautifully for, well, since
Oh,
World War II.
By the way, Norman, just to go back to your point about the short-term thinking, that's true in higher education also in terms of student enrollment. Anybody that knows, I mean, higher education, the bottom line lives on student enrollment. There are other factors involved. Well, if you're a big football school, I guess that's different. But I mean, for most schools, it's that enrollment. And we have a terrible time, really convincing our admissions officials that they need to think beyond simply the next admissions year. And for instance, we know that, and they call it the demographic cliff is coming. And what they mean by that is the traditional driver of enrollment, especially at our school, Michigan Tech, which is a technological school, which has been white men. I think it's 70% in the College of Engineering. But we know that demographic is shrinking. And that if they want to continue the growth pattern, we're talking about our shareholders, for us. But if we're talking about maintaining the growth pattern, we're going to have to expand that pool. And that's going to have to include women. It's going to have to include, students of color, students who have not participated in high levels of higher education, because that's where the demographic trends are moving in terms of the increases. And everybody will sit around and nod their heads and say, that's absolutely true. But then when you get to talk to the director of admissions about the next admission cycle, it's not about, hey, let's go into communities and talk to seventh graders and students that are coming up the pipeline, making sure that they've taken their math and all their physics and science so that they can prepare it. They want to talk to 11th graders, because 11th graders are going to be the students that are going to fill the seats the next year. And to get them much beyond that conversation is very difficult.
But the curriculum in education beyond secondary is just horrible. Horrible. Not that some people just simply can't achieve it, but that the results are so disastrous. And Bill can probably comment much more strongly than I can on this failure.
Well, I think to follow up what Mike was talking about, we had a similar, for 31 years, I was at the vocational technical college level in Maine. And But the answer for us was to merge into a community college model where we took all the trade, we kept the trade classes, which were predominantly male except for nursing, I think mostly nursing. And we went to a liberal studies curriculum where half the students that go there now are taking their standard liberal arts courses, core courses, and transferring to university as a junior. And so I mean, that's a good example, I think, of being flexible and to answer what Mike's talking about and realizing, and we went from 80% or 85% men to 65% women. And as we're seeing across the country, and this is another whole question, but women are much more motivated to go to education and to learn and to not stay home and play video games. I don't mean to stereotype, but that's what we see a lot in Maine. And you know, men used to be able to get really good jobs without a college education, working at mills and factories. But since a lot of those jobs have been shipped overseas, they haven't caught up. And so I think the Mike's absolutely right. We got to get creative in higher ed about how we're gonna do that. In a big way has been to provide partnerships with the four-year universities to let them get their undergraduate core classes at a community college level to save a lot of money.
Okay, another question for you. And particularly in the 20th and 21st century, what's the correlation of the rise and fall of unions with social justice and corporate compassion?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And obviously we've seen the demonization of unions for, you know, when I was in college, I had a union job. It was part-time, Teamsters Union. And it was working at a bakery. We made 10,000 loaves of bread an hour, you know, everything you could imagine, very, you know, big, huge bakery that made everything. But because we were union shop, you know, in 1971, I think I was making like, you know, or 72 when I started, I think I was making like $3.50 an hour, which was like, oh my goodness sakes, because, you know, the kids at McDonald's were making $1.50 an hour. But, you know, because I was in a union shop, you know, it was a lot better and it was a great job. And without that job, you know, college would have been a very different picture for me. But, you know, even then I can remember, you know, oh, unions are this and they once served a good function, but, you know, they're no good anymore. And we've seen them now beat back over the last, you know, really 40, 50 years.
Bob, expanding on your question about the unions, which I think it's pretty clear unions have been busted. There's a certain irony, isn't there not, to the fact that for all these many, many decades, maybe centuries, having a college education was the way to a good paying job, and it was limited to white men, mostly. Now, just as women and minorities are getting the majority in many schools, including my alma mater, Yale. My goodness, Ivy League Yale is now a minority student body. Just as this is happening, AI is coming along and is making having a college degree fundamentally useless. Is it just a coincidence, or is this just misogynism still at work? The women's and the minorities get in there, and now it's worthless. You say, what we need is a union of thinking people to set a wage, not just for ourselves, but for everybody. Maybe that's the answer.
Well, you know, it's interesting, you know, to hear us talk. I mean, if I came in had my red MAGA hat on, I would just say, well, yeah, this is really curious. You people are talking like people who belong to the elites, and that this country has totally denigrated, let's say, apprenticeship programs. My wife was a CFO for a big electrical subcontractor and also a big plumbing subcontractor. And those union trade jobs paid far better than possibly the majority of college graduates, at least college graduates early in their career. And so some are a whole fascination with more and more people going to college. If we look at um, Germany, for instance, they probably have 10 times as many apprenticeship openings as we have in the US because they train people for, um, skilled trades. Um, so it's very easy for someone to point their fingers at the cultural elite, even if we're not part of the um, financial elite.
A tool and die maker in Germany makes more than a college professor.
Yeah.
My son makes
So what's the
65,000.
role, I'm curious, this is both to Linda and Paul. What's the role of unions in Canada, and have they strengthened, weakened in relationship to corporation and corporate growth?
They had weakened quite a bit, as previously noted. But there seems to be an upswing right now. Because I think that corporations have maybe, not kept up to what unions would have kept up with in the last 10, 20 years. And so unions seem to be where people are going for help because, the government or the corporations are not giving them the kind of help that they want. So there seems to be an upswing going up on that. But also to just talk about what Mike talked about in the UK, the same thing happened in Canada. Is after the Second World War, that's when we got universal health care. And I think that that's what's, you were talking about. I think that's the difference between Canada's maybe more aligned with what the European countries are doing, giving that balance. I'm not going to call it socialism because it's not socialism, but giving it that balance to, and the US hasn't had that. And so therefore, your system is so different. The capitalistic system in the US is so different than what the rest of the world's capitalism is, and that's where you need to find something to rejig that, because we see where it's going, and it's, the question is there a social consciousness in your capitalism? And I don't think there is. And I think the reason why there is in Europe and in Canada is because we've had some of these social programs that have made people, like the tribes, force everybody to believe. I mean, we as children, when you go to school, we it's okay to have everybody go to the hospital and everybody can afford it because it doesn't cost you anything. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's ingrained in us, and that's it, and it's not ingrained in the US system. So I've lived in the States, my daughter went to school in the States, and I see the difference. And it's just like that social consciousness for most people doesn't, for some people it does, but for a lot of people it doesn't. And that's why the capitalism, the rich, it's me society has taken over that, because that conversation doesn't even exist in the US, according to me. I see Norman saying yes to that. So I agree with what Mike said about the UK, and that's also in Canada. So,
And we're going backwards in the United States on that now. So it's not like we're even trying to catch up with Canada. We're going the opposite direction.
Is it fair to say then that the United States is an outlier when it comes to the global concept of social conscious for capitalism?
Bingo.
I would
Absolutely.
say that, yeah.
Susan, you've hit, I think, really closer to the core of this than anyone here today. I have an example which, if you could run it through the Canadian perspective, would be helpful. I remember years ago, I was at a fish store, very high-end fish store, and I decided not to buy lobster tails because they were too expensive. I was still a student then in law school. And this woman in front of me bought 6 lobster tails with her food stamps. And that really pissed me off. How does that fit into the Canadian concept of nobody minds everybody going to the hospital because it's free?
That's very different. That we don't have food stamps, number one, so that doesn't exist in our country. So, I think that what people believe in is that minimum standard of living, for whatever that number is, for people to be able to survive. We all agree that that is a good thing, but I don't think those people would be buying lobster tails on the money they're getting anyway. But we don't have food stamps, so that's not really a discussion.
So it's not only a difference in how capitalism versus social conscience capitalism is, it's what people are expecting. You're
Yes,
saying Canadians wouldn't expect that if they were given some largesse, a little extra money, they wouldn't go out and buy the lobster tails where Americans do. What's that all about?
It's
I mean, that's a
also,
general question.
there's another way of looking at kind of that minimum standard you were talking about, Linda, because so when we were in Panama, for instance, there's about 15 different food items that the government subsidizes. So the chicken, eggs, things like that. Everybody, I could go down and buy my chicken for the dirt cheap price that anybody else could. So there was this basic standard that was assumed that people would be able to buy a basket of food at the level of the minimum wage in Panama, which was like $2 an hour. And so I think there are different ways of setting that minimum standard of living, and maybe Canada, I don't know if it is, but maybe it's more like Panama, and that just the expectation is that we all can have this level. And so, nobody's
for
buying
us,
the lobster tail.
it's a question of taxation. So if you make below a certain amount, you don't pay taxes.
Right.
And so therefore, if you're only making, well, in Canada, minimum wage is $17 an hour. I know that will shock you, but if you're making less than the $17 an hour, then you won't pay taxes. And you might even get a subsidy for your apartment or something like that, so that those people have that minimum standard of living,
So when
at
both
least.
in both of those examples, Linda, in Canada, the way you're describing it and the way Joyce is describing it in Panama, it's all different ways that government moderates and teaches people. Like you would say when you were a kid, you learned that everybody had health care. Well, that's because that guy in Saskatchewan decided, I forget his name, but he's the one that came up with the whole concept of healthcare, so that and that is valued by the populace, even among people that don't totally agree with it. Nobody wants to get rid of it. So the role of government is clearly there to balance out the greed side of capitalism. And with the chickens, that's a great idea. I wish we had it here. I mean, that in some ways that'd be better than food stamps, because at least they could get chicken and eggs and they wouldn't be buying the friggin' lobster tails with it.
Yeah, Bill, very well said. Very well said. And that's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
So when you're growing up, you just understand, that that's just the way that society functions, and it's okay to make money, and it's, whatever, but
Yeah.
it's not the be all of end all. And it's not just everything is just greed that supersedes everything else.
Right.
And like you said, nobody would ever take, like, I think you'd have a riot to take away any of those standards, because people really, it's a fundamental thing in the way that we think, how important it is for our society to continue the way that it is.
And it's based on the very simple concept that if you're sick, you should be able to go to the doctor. I mean, how
That's right.
hard is that to think that way? I don't know if I've seen it a couple places now, but there is this these data about millennials in the United States. I don't know how many of you've seen it, but there was the COVID situation, and the death rates were, but apparently, with the passing of COVID, the death rates among millennials, which had increased in COVID because of whatever, they're not dropping in the same way that they are in other countries. And people are starting to say, well, what's going on with these millennial death rates in the United States? And part of the thing that they're thinking about, and they're, some of the usual suspects, because, these are, I think that's 25 to 40. I can't remember the age group exactly, but they're not in an age group that should be dying a lot. But a lot of it has to do with drug use. Some of it is suicide. It can be, gunshot wounds and those kinds of things. And one of the things they're attributing it to is the fact that, this is a generation that, as we've already kind of talked, that missed out on sort of the benefits of low college, et cetera, that we baby boomers got to experience. They paid high, had to pay a lot more for college. The jobs aren't out there the way they used to be. Buying a house, and there's more despair. There's less, they can't go to the doctor. And so we're starting to see that, our system is starting to eat our young. And that's
basically, we've got a cultural deficiency in the US. There's no other explanation. It's not just government, it's the culture in the US.
Couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing that, if you look at healthcare around the world, if you take a place like France, let's say, their health outcomes are better than the US, and their per capita spending is about half as much. So for the US to keep believing the fiction that free markets will make everything cheaper and more available, just has not worked. And we don't seem to be willing to face up to that, to just say that, this is a market failure, and that market failures, even Milton Friedman would say that market failures are one of the few excuses for the government to step in and do something. So the way that we've kept our public mesmerized on this idea that free markets are going to solve all social problems is a fascinating example of mass delusion, I'd say.
How do you change that cultural shift, though? How do you change that cultural mentality?
Magic wand.
Bill?
Good question, Linda. We haven't done it yet.
Okay.
We just need another 10,000 years to work on that.
But how is it that American culture is so deviant from that of Western Europe?
Yeah.
There's very
Something
simple,
simply
very
can't understand.
No, it's the way America started out, Che. We started out with a very homogenized white community that was superior to all the local folks. If somebody was pissed off or not wanting to cooperate, they could always move west. There was always a release valve for discontent. And if you have a release valve for discontent, problems don't get solved. In Europe, it's quite the opposite. No escape valve until the 15th or 16th century. And so they had gone for thousands of years with no escape valve. And so they evolved differently.
Well, in addition to that, though, we had a very significant minority who had no civil rights. And starting with the plantation owners in the South and continuing through Reagan and on into the MAGA world, the whites have always been scared with the idea that, if you tax us, who are hardworking people who have earned our money, just to give it to other people who didn't work hard, who don't deserve it, then that's not just inefficient, that's immoral. And so we have a permanent underclass in this country that always is handy as a threat. I mean, even in the idea that we need to have guns to protect us. I mean, ultimately, who are we going to protect ourselves against? First, it was slaves. Now it's the poor. So I think that's one significant difference in U.S. history. That
now it's the police, by the way.
My perception is universal suffrage without qualifications is not effective in terms of governance. Anybody who wishes to be naturalized American has to understand the governments of the country. But people who can't basically read or write have the same vote as people with intelligence.
Well, that's the old problem of what's meant by the phrase "all men are created equal." And you got one half saying that means all men and women, of course, are created should have equal opportunity, but that isn't what 90% of the people view it as. That's not Darwinian enough, say.
Well, gang, it's just about noon. I've got a question for you. I'm kind of at a loss, but this has been percolating in my mind. Should we explore the threat to science literacy or the threat on science itself globally for next time? What do you think?
I vote thumbs up.
Interesting topic.
And
Yeah,
very,
could you get,
very relevant, yes.
I think that's a fine topic. Somewhere I think a useful topic would be, is empathy always a good thing? Because
Is what?
that's a hot empathy, because that's a hot button in the media right now, and it's part of the creed, if you will, of the humanists. The importance of empathy and the very value of it is being challenged culturally in the U.S.
Which one?
Can we distinguish between empathy and compassion, two different parts of the coin? But yeah.
Well, empathy is the word being tossed around in the media. I think your point is well taken, but the media isn't making any subtle distinction there.
Of course not.
Of course not, exactly. That may be part of the problem.
It's part of the
Which
problem.
is it? Science or empathy? Quick vote.
Science first.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. You agree with that, Paul?
Yep, I agree.
Oh, I'm okay with it being first.
Okay.
Be sure to include the closing of the Western mind, by the way, about the first great assault on scientific thought by the early Christian church.
Yes, yes.
Outside of that, yeah, I think it's a great topic.
Okay, that's what it'll be. And I'll do the research on it, see what I can come up with.
Bob,
Thank
you always provide such good background reading and videos.
Yes.
Phenomenal. Thank you.
Yes,
You're all
absolutely.
quite welcome. And I've
Thanks a
really,
lot.
really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.
thank you. Nice to see everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
See you all next time.
Okay, bye-bye.
Next month.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.